Okay, well, welcome to this webinar on the dawn of the requirement of the ISO 56001 certification. It's exciting times for all of us in the innovation industry. People like the three of us you're looking at right now have been in this industry for a long time, several decades in many cases. And so this sort of increase in professionalization of innovation, I think, is something that we all welcome. But of course, it requires a bit of explanation and a bit of discussion, and this is the purpose of this webinar today. So yes, VID 6001 was released just a couple of weeks ago, and what we're here today, joined by Willie and Sarah, is to talk a little bit about that, to explain a little bit about what this might mean for the industry and hopefully how it's going to benefit us all as professionals operating in this space. So I'm going to introduce both of our speakers, and then we've got a set of questions we're going to go through, but we're very open to having questions throughout the session. And if it's not super easy to integrate them into the standard process, I'll deal with them at the end as well. So let's kick off with an introduction for Sarah. So Sarah Husk, MBA, she's a principal consultant here at Hype Innovation, and she's been guiding Fortune 2000 companies for quite some time on innovation strategy and ISO certification preparation. She's involved in developing the international innovation standards and has extensive experience in breakthrough and continuous innovation. So welcome, Sarah, a colleague of mine for quite some years now, and I'm delighted to have you join me. So moving on to Willie. Willie's got over 25 years of management experience in the private sector, holds an MSc in computer science since 1994. He's been specializing in implementing management systems, starting with ISO 9002 certification at the German stamping facilities. That's some time ago, I guess. Willie has conducted thousands of audits across various standards, including 9001, 27001, CSA Star, and 23301. So working with multiple Fortune 100 companies globally, he's worked with several international certification bodies, and he's actively involved in the ISO IEC committees responsible for writing standards on information security, artificial intelligence, and innovation management. He's a frequent speaker at global conferences, and I'm absolutely delighted to have him join us today. So I'm going to kick off with the obvious question that everybody asks me, and I think it's only fair that I ask my panel here. The first question I'm going to put to you, Sarah: can innovation be standardized?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I know that it may be a little bit counterintuitive. So creativity is not necessarily standardized. Totally get that. So if people are defining it as the creative portion, that's actually different than what we're talking about. This is all around the best practices associated with the process of innovation, the strategy of innovation, and being able to measure how you're doing and continually improve that process. So from that perspective, I do believe that, yes, those things can be standardized.
Anything you want to add to that, Willie?
Well, as Sarah said, it's not about the creative portion of it, right? It's about the processes around innovation can definitely be standardized. And later on in our discussion, we will go a little bit more into the details, I assume, in terms of the structure of the standard. But for example, would it be necessary to identify what is the scope? Important to have some kind of internal review process? Yes, of course. And all those kind of things can be standardized and should be standardized.
Yeah, I completely agree. I was an innovation management professional starting in about 2001 was my sort of first entry into this area. And what I found is that leadership really didn't understand innovation processes. And honestly, my life was so much harder than it would have been today if those same leaders had learned about innovation and had some kind of standard processes to follow. It simply wasn't part of the lexicon back then. Innovation in certain industries was very mature, less so in others, but there was no real standard. So let me come back to you, Willie, and I have this question here about whether we're really talking about a science here or a management discipline, and what's in it for people and companies when it comes to this professionalization of this innovation.
Well, fundamentally, if there is some kind of, let's say, standard, then people can rely upon that standard. And my prime example is, in preparation for this webinar, we were talking about all kinds of travels, and next week I'll be in the UK and in Europe. Well, what is on my first, what is the first item on my do not forget list? Travel adapters. Why in the world do we need travel adapters just because we travel from one country to another? Because, well, somewhere in the past, somebody decided that there are X amount of different ways to have 3 prongs for delivering electricity. And that is obviously exactly the opposite of standardization. So standardization in itself has the benefit that it can be making life easier, that things can be compared. And if we now are talking about 56001 as being a management system, that also means that, well, the system can be certified. And that in itself would provide trust, would provide evidence to the outside world that there is some kind of systematic approach. And that is about assurance. That is about delivering to the external party, yes, it's not just me who says I'm good. It's somebody else who has verified my system and confirms that, well, it's fulfilling a standard. And therefore it's comparable.
And so turning to you, Sarah, do you think there's value in this for companies, for people to have this standardized as well? I mean, commercial value?
I do. And I think so if we think about the standard itself, it really focuses on achieving tangible value, and that value is defined by the company. So whether that's dollars and cents for a commercial organization, societal impact for socially focused organizations, it doesn't really matter, but you start with what is it that we need to achieve in order to achieve that value. The other thing that I really think too that, is starting to come in as we're having these conversations are also things around, if I'm looking at that front end of innovation and I'm dealing with all kinds of insights and trends and that kind of thing, that is one skill set. And there's one, process around that. That person may or may not be the right person and may not even enjoy taking an innovation all the way out into the marketplace. And I think that is another skill set. So I think there's value in, definitely commercial value, but also recognizing, hey, we might need different skill sets, different tool sets, all those things. And then I also think that because it is a measured process with the eye towards continually making it better, if your competitors are out there with a standardized process and they're working on ways to make it better and you're not, I do think that poses a risk. So
yeah.
Long answer, but yes.
And I suspect, especially in those organizations that are business to business organizations, especially those organizations where they're forming long-term partnerships with their clients, if I'm trying to pick a supplier or a partner, I want to know that they're going to be bringing something special to the equation, that they're going to be able to be continually innovating and bringing better things. And actually, again, I go back to my own career as a corporate innovator, and we see sometimes this innovation theater where it's all a performance, but actually not a lot gets delivered. Is your expectation, therefore, Sarah, that we're going to reduce a bit of that, and so it is going to become an increasing level of professionalization in the sector?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Colin, and you're right. Rather than the issue that you have, I think, with a lot of that theater is everybody focuses on the awareness and excitement and the ideas and those kinds of things, and that's great because you want all that creativity flowing into your company. But then when you come back and say, okay, but then what happened around how were the concepts validated? How did we make decisions around them? How did we get it into the marketplace? It's like, oh, so I do think to the point that you're making, that absolutely, I think it will support and help. And it'll also give people an understanding of what those back end disciplines look like. I think that might be lacking.
I think it's fascinating because often, talk to organizations, you find that many of the successes they've had have been happy accidents. They've really not been through rigorous process adoption. And then they tend to try and repeat those happy accidents. And eventually they really struggle because they don't really know how to get to where they're going to. And I think that causes a bit of distrust in leadership sometimes because they can't see how this world is evolving. And maybe a question for you, Willie, do you see the standard helping gain leadership buy-in? And if so, how do you think that's going to manifest itself?
Yes, absolutely. It's a requirement in the standard to have leadership commitment. And that in itself obviously then helps to foster and cultivate, well, the culture necessary for sustained innovation activities. To your point, a lot of successes are based on accidents. Well, on a regular basis, I hear something like, well, this is the idea, blah, blah, blah. And then somebody says, so how are we going to scale that? Well, and the answer is, we worry about that later. Well, that is actually the foundation for failure, because just because it works in a one-off situation doesn't mean that you can scale it to deliver it 1,000 times per hour later on when in production. And people with different backgrounds, with different experiences, need to be involved in that process. And that is being supported by, well, management commitment. If management on the very, very top is behind the idea, they will make the necessary resources available. And that then will help to create a very systematic approach to innovation.
Anything you want to add to that, Sarah? I know that, when we often see leadership who are really struggling with this language around innovation, talked about the different competencies and skill sets, the different processes. Often the leaders that we're dealing with, they didn't study innovation. They didn't go and wasn't part of their MBA classes. And I wonder if this perhaps can help us in that realm as well.
Yeah, that's a great point, especially for some of us who have more wisdom under our belt, time, etc. I definitely wasn't in my MBA class, and I don't MBA courses, and I don't know that that it was for today's leaders. So I think this really fills in a gap. I think another thing that really is supportive around this is kind of going back to the standard itself, thinking about it's pretty clear on what those leadership responsibilities are, which is nice. Not that you want to make it a checklist, but it's really around all the things that leaders do already. So things like, setting the vision and direction, communicating the importance, leading by example, setting the tone for the culture, making sure that there are things like, proper resourcing. I know, Colin, I think you and I could have another 3-hour conversation on what we've seen about people not having proper resourcing for innovation. Willie, what you were saying really resonated with me, because a lot of times, like what we have seen are just like singular heroes just pulling things through an organization to get it. So that happy accident is like some superhero in the organization getting that sucker through. So yeah, I do think that there's so much good stuff in there. Sorry, Colin, go ahead.
and let's face it, skills and resources will be stolen in case of an emergency. So you have this team of people working very concentrated and focused on a particular new thing and try to figure out the best way. And then something happens in the factory. Something happens in a distribution center. Guess what happens? One or all of them are getting pulled out to address the emergency. Fast forward 3 weeks later, where were we again? Sorry, that is not exactly good management. Does it happen? Yes. Can it be prevented? Most likely not. But can it be managed better? Absolutely. And I think a systematic approach like described in 56001 will help an organization to be better prepared for this kind of situations and take the appropriate actions with the support of the executive team.
I just want to take a sidestep, building on something that you both mentioned there in terms of leadership and the fact that these are leadership are comfortable with ISO in other flavors, right? So Willie, I mentioned in your intro that you've been involved in other ISO standards. Maybe for those audience members that are a little bit less familiar, they may not be aware that any kind of standard, ISO standard, has the same structure. Maybe you can just comment on that a little bit, because I suspect that maybe leaders, they might not be familiar with innovation, but they understand ISO.
Yes. So just to clarify, there are literally tens of thousands of ISO standards, or should I say tens of thousands of ISO documents, because in the ISO world, we differentiate between standards and technical specifications and blah, 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 right? And even within the standards, there might be standards that define, I don't know, the physical appearance and dimension of a USB connector. Not kidding, real fact. And there might be standards that define, I don't know, the height of a pole mast for flying the flag, right? But what we are really talking about is management system standards. And the most well-known ISO management system standard is the ISO 9001, quality management. It has been around for, I don't know, you mentioned, earlier in my career, I had the privilege to implement a quality management system at a stamping facility. So it goes back to 1994, at least, on an ISO level, let alone to other countries had their own standards. So the ISO 9001 is, for all intents and purposes, the mother of all management system standards. And based on that ISO standard, other standards were developed. So for example, ISO 14001 for environmental management. But there is another document behind those management system standards that is called the high-level structure. It's an internal ISO document that directs the standard producers, the writers of ISO management system standards, to follow a very disciplined approach and very disciplined structure. And that means that if you have an ISO 9001 management system and you look at the structure of ISO 56001, you say, just hold on, aren't they the same? Well, the structure is exactly the same by intent, by design. Now, are there slight differences? Of course. Additional paragraphs have been added. Of course, that makes sense. Also, the content is obviously specific to innovation management and not to quality management. But the benefit of this kind of approach is obviously, if an organization is already certified to, let's say, ISO 9001 or ISO 27001 information security management, and now they would like to go for the implementation and obviously then certification of their innovation management system, it's actually relatively simple, because they are already familiar with, oh, we need to define the scope. We need to have management commitment. We need to train people. We have to have some kind of document control system. Yes, we need to have some kind of internal audit system. We need to have some kind of improvement process. Not a surprise. All those kind of concepts are already well known within the organization. And that is being reflected in 56001. So if somebody says, where should we start when implementing a 56001 management system? I say, well, you have already the two most important tools in your toolbox, the internal audits and the corrective action process, from the quality management process or from the information security management process. Because you now do an internal audit against the requirements of 56001, and you will recognize, oh, there are a lot of things that we need to do. Wonderful. How do you manage those things to be addressed? Well, it's called corrective action process. You will identify those issues as gaps, and then you take them step by step. And sooner or later, I wouldn't say in no time, because it will take some time, but in a disciplined approach, you will have then implemented a 56001 management system. I trust that helps.
Absolutely fantastic. I'm going to move on to a different topic now, and Sarah, I'd like to talk a little bit about speed in innovation. And I'm seeing this in all kinds of different organizations. Speed being able to get to market faster, get a good quality product or capability to the market is becoming the differentiator. We want to be first is the kind of thing that I hear a lot. And I wonder how you believe the standard is going to help with that part of the puzzle in terms of accelerating the journey to innovation.
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, that's a great reason to invest in the innovation standard. So just think about something like AI. I know everybody's focused on AI right now, and it's like, okay, we got to get out there. We got to be first. What are we going to do? How are we going to do that? Everybody's
Yep.
asking all those
Yep.
questions, of course. Imagine this. You have, because you're following this standard, you have a listening engine. So you understand what's going on in the market and where you can find those opportunities, also the risks that might be coming your way as well. So you've got that listening engine always on, always doing analysis, taking it through that process. Also, because you've got your standard in place, you have decision-making processes that, help you bring things in, understand what we're doing with them, where does this fit into the portfolio, what should we remove, etc. You've got ways of funding those new things coming in. So when you talk about speed, I think one of the big things that slows people down right now, honestly, is not having that process and having some of those things. They're simple but complicated things, right? Like the decision-making process and where should the budget come from? Is it OpEx? Is it CapEx? Is it,
Right.
who knows? So it's all those things. But if you have those decisions made, then no matter what comes next, whether it's, I was reading about quantum Internet of Things. I mean, so that's on its way too, and it's AI enabled. So I'm just saying all those things that are coming at us so quickly, if you have a good process, I think it makes it a heck of a lot easier to just get those all the way through.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. What you're actually saying is there's just some inherent inefficiencies of not having a process at all. And Willie, I'm guessing you see this across other standards as well, which is that one of the big wins is by putting a standard is everything gets faster because we do have the standard out of the box answers for these questions.
Yes, and having processes is actually nothing really strange. I'm pretty sure that you have a process when waking up in the morning. I'm pretty sure that you have a process that you follow when you travel to another country. You mentioned you travel in the next couple of days to North America. Of course, you have a process. It might be not documented, which is not necessary, right? But there is an established routine. And that might be, I don't know, 48 hours before you leave, you check, is my flight still going? 24 hours before you get the notification, it's time to check in. You check in, you make sure, okay, the flight is still there. At the same time, you have already your suitcase open and ready. You're calculating how many days am I there, blah, blah, blah. All those kind of inputs into your process will lead to a very high success rate. Yes, we all know if and when you travel, you will have a story to tell afterwards. That comes with the territory, right? And in innovation, it will be the same. But if you don't have a process, it will be a disaster.
Yeah, I love that.
Arrive at the airport and they say passport, please, and you say passport what? Right?
Exactly. But it also strikes me that it takes some of the uncertainty, some of the anxiety, some of the stress out of doing any activity. We have these processes because we learn them and we know what works and what doesn't work. And so what we're saying here is that, well, as an organization, you might not have done X, Y, and Z, but if you can learn what others have done, this is going to actually help you get faster. It's going to help take some of that stress away, and you're more likely to get reliable and predictable results.
Yes, and that brings me to the importance of change management, which is somehow connected to resolutions of issues, corrective actions. So if something is wrong, that's great because it's a great opportunity to not make that mistake again in the future. As long as we are able to identify it, proper document, and take the appropriate actions, and most likely that means revise and review review and revise our processes. And over time, that means that our processes will getting better and better.
So I just want to build on something you mentioned earlier, Willie, and I'm getting two quite distinct reactions from organizations when I'm talking to them about the standard. On one end of the scale, organizations are saying, we're going to pursue, we want to be accredited, we want the standard, we want to be able to rubber stamp our organization. But at the other end of the scale, I see organizations say, well, we might not pursue formal accreditation, but we see the standards as a North Star. It's a set of good policies and practices that we would want to follow. And I wonder, from your perspective, your experience, why an organization should choose to actually invest the time and the money to actually get the standard. Can you offer your perspective of what the value is in that, as opposed to necessarily just, you know, I'm going to adopt some of these principles over time?
Yeah. So the first example, something like, you know, we only want to get the rubber stamp. It will be total disaster,
right?
Because from an auditor's perspective, I can tell you the first audit is the easiest one. To get certified is actually pretty simple for every management system standard.
Yeah.
But to survive the second surveillance audit or even the recertification audit 3 years later is a little bit more challenging. And then it's pretty embarrassing to go back to your customers and say, yeah, that certificate we had, actually, we did not renew, or should I say, we lost it. And that is very embarrassing. But that is happening in organizations that just go for the rubber stamping. So if you're not behind it, don't do it. On the other hand, organizations that are genuinely interested in implementing a solid management system, but are then not seeking a formal certification by an accredited certification body like SGS, well, my question would be, and why are you not spending that extra 1% to get an external certificate? Because the actual certification cost, the cost of certification, is minimal compared to the cost of implementing and maintaining a system. So if you have already a system in place that is working, well, then there is really no need to change something, right? And then getting that attestation, that confirmation from an external party, that is then the value. Because as we all know, if somebody says, trust me, I'm good, we all know it's not the case. No, it's a guarantee. That person is not good, right? The moment somebody says, trust me, that person lost already my confidence. Just my experience.
It's the biggest red flag you ever see, that's for sure.
Yes, exactly. And the other experience I have, if somebody says, I'm really not sure, I'm not an expert, that person knows more than the person who says, I'm the absolutely expert.
Right, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. So Sarah, turning back to you, it's taken some time to get this standard over the line. I think, you know, it's been more than a decade or so of organizations and people talking about this standard for innovation. I wonder, now it has been set, whether you believe the standard will change over time and how that process works.
Yeah, that's great. And the answer to that is yes, standards do change over time as new things are learned. And the way that shows up is actually just in the standard name. Like if you were to look at 9001, like Willie was saying, you'd see that there are different versions. Now that does take time to revise and update those. And it does go through the same, rigor. It goes through, having all of the different countries come in and weigh in on those things, because it's important that it applies to everyone, that it really is a universal standard. But as innovation matures, changes, etc., absolutely, I think it will evolve over time, and I think it should.
Yeah. Have you seen the same, Willie, with other standards, and what sort of iteration periods are we talking about?
Yeah, so there's actually, guess what? That there is a requirement coming from ISO in terms of how often standards need to be reviewed. It's standardized, right? It's the review of standards is standardized.
Of course.
And so the usual interval is between 3 and 6 years. That doesn't mean that the standard is going to change after 6 years or 3 years. It can change. And yeah, on a regular basis, standards, especially management system standards, are changing. So on a regular basis, we have those adjustments. So for example, 27001 information security management system.
I didn't tell you today. Yeah, I think I didn't. So sorry.
I think we have
today's
somebody
an
that
after work.
yeah, we're hearing another conversation.
Yes, and it's October 1st. So,
Oh wait, we got it. There we go.
Thank you.
Apologies to everybody. Carry on,
yes.
Willie.
So
No worries.
October 1st is an important date. We know that, but kidding aside. So for example, ISO 27001 was changed a couple of years ago, and originally it only said information security. Well, of course, the people on the committee knew what it meant, but the general population didn't know. So there was this confusion. Well, the new version of the standard says information security, cybersecurity, and privacy. Or for you in the UK, privacy. So this is an example of the standard title is changed, the intent is not changed, but because the title is changed, it is made clearer what happens and what that standard is applicable to. And then also in 27001, we saw an change in the controls that are necessary to implement and address security and cybersecurity risks. Well, where's that coming from? Well, over many, many years, practitioners said the standard approach we have right now is not really practical. There are challenges. Wonderful. Let's change then how the standard is structured. And I can see the same happening with 56001, that in 4 years, 6 years, we'll see a new version. I'm pretty sure that in just 2 years' time, we will start reviewing it and collect feedback from the market, from practitioners, from organizations who have implemented it, as well as from auditors who have audited systems, saying, that is a clause nobody understands, or that is a clause that is not clear enough, or whatever. And that's fantastic. That is part of continuous improvement.
And so it sounds like there's a combination of just the experience of applying the standard and applying it in the real world rigorously gives us some insights in terms of how it can be refined, but also external factors. Stuff happens. I mean, if we turn back the clock 10 years, we would not have anticipated necessarily this progress we now see in AI, for example. So I suspect that, the learnings as a society and as an industry that we make will also get, absorbed into changes as well, by the sounds of things.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. So, Sarah, in terms of people who perhaps maybe less familiar with ISO, but are, maybe corporate innovators, how would you typically advise them to sort of digest the standards within their organization? Where should they go? What should they read? What's a good process for them to follow?
Oh, that's a great question. And because truly the ISO language and it's very structured, and not that innovation is not with structure, but it's not necessarily what people are used to, maybe used to digesting. So I think there are a few different things that you can do. Number one, it is important to look at the standard itself and really reflect on what are those things and how do they apply in your organization. But I think the other thing, to Willie's point earlier, is what we've also found is typically the innovation teams are not necessarily talking to those governance teams that may be doing things like quality, health and safety, cybersecurity, all those things. Those people are experts at understanding the process of how to go through and get certified. They're also very familiar with reading the language and helping people understand that, especially, like what Willie was talking about, those common pieces, like all the management systems have something called context of the organization that's really focused on opportunities, risks, and strategy. And your, the person or people who work with those other standards in your organization can be incredibly helpful. So I would reach out to them as a first step and just start learning some of those things.
Willie, anything you'd like to build upon there?
Yeah. I'm not a big fan of committees, although I'm sitting on committees, right? But but yes, to Sarah's point, grab the information security manager, grab the CISO, grab the quality VP, and say, can you interpret that for me? And
Right.
most likely that person says, what portion don't you understand? Because for that person, it's standard stuff, right?
Right.
Yes, it's fine-tuned for innovation, no question about that. But to Sarah's point, those people live and breathe those compliance standards. They know exactly what is meant when the standard says there shall be a document control system, that kind of thing for me, right? But for an innovation specialist, what exactly does that mean? What is meant with this shall include documents of external origin?
Right.
Huh? What? Well, again, for quality folks, it's something like, yeah, don't you know, kind of thing. But they are able to explain it. So they are the experts in translating ISO lingo in normal person's language.
Yeah, very good point. And I think having read, some of the documentation, I can encourage people, because if you haven't read an ISO document before, it is a little bit impenetrable for you, for the layperson. But there are people in every organization that are more familiar and can help there. Great advice. So maybe step back to you, Sarah. Let's suppose an organization wants to understand how they currently perform against the standard. What would you advise is the best first step that they make?
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And I think it really comes into doing that initial analysis. Where are we in relationship to the standard? Because until you know that, you don't really have the ability to create that roadmap for how we're going to get there. And there's some simple things, that you can consider. So, like for example, do you currently have a documented policy for innovation? Do you currently have a documented strategy for innovation? If the answer is no, those are requirements. So those are things that you can even get started with. But until you do that analysis and say, okay, what is it that we need to do? And then where are we? There's really no way to do that. And there is, of course, a guidance standard for how to do that kind of analysis. So in 56,000, it is actually a family of standards, and there is a standard that can help you get started with that. Of course, I would also encourage, again, talking to people in your organization that really understand this stuff, because it is a process that you go through.
And if my memory is correct, that's 56,004, that gap analysis. Is that correct?
That's
All right.
right.
Well, I'm learning. Maybe you can also offer some opinions on that, Willie. I mean, again, going on your experience of doing these, of auditing this, the value of the gap analysis. What's your perspective on that? He's just muted.
Yes, and obviously that means I need to unmute myself. Gap assessments, gap analysis is absolutely crucial. And that's a very important step. But that could be actually combined with what I mentioned earlier, an internal audit, using the internal audit process for an existing management system, for example, the quality management system, but then as the standard 56001 should be used. And yes, of course, it's absolutely imperative to get a copy of the standard. And unfortunately, I have seen organizations that had not read the standard when I arrived for doing an audit. And that's a deal breaker, right? I mean, how can an organization implement any management system if they don't know what the requirement of the standard is? So obtaining a copy of the standard and supporting documents, whether this is 56,002 or 56,004, that's a different story. But I also believe that there is that thing of attending webinars like this one, attending auditors classes. I'm pretty sure that within a short period of time, I can guarantee you that there will be auditors classes available and implementers classes available to address the requirements of the standard and translate it again from that dry ISO stuff into something that is tangible, that people can bring home, implement in their organizations. But at the end of the day, nobody can help you if you don't read the standard. I'm sorry to say that. Many organizations just simply browse through the standard and say, yeah, of course, no problem. And then later on, they recognize, well, there are problems. And, when we were still having copy machines, and, I'm not advocating violating IP rights, intellectual property rights, but when we still had copy machines, one of my suggestions was, hey, print out the standard, go to a copy machine, reduce it to 80%, and then you have a nice white area on the right-hand side or left-hand side, depending on how you put the paper there, and then you make notes for yourself, and you make references to where is the evidence to support when the standard says the organization shall. And that is a tool that doesn't cost anything, right? But is super, super helpful to get your head around, well, there are all these requirements. How in the world are we going to manage them? Well, my question is, how do you eat an elephant? Piece by piece, right? And this is how you implement a management system standard. You're not implementing it in a big bucket. No, you're implementing it in small little steps, step by step. And in a well-organized organization, I guarantee you 70% of the stuff that is required is already there.
I'm sure you're right. I'm going to open up for audience questions in a second, so feel free to just put into the chat any questions that you have. And I have one question from myself before we move on to that, and maybe I'll go back to you, Sarah. One of the things that I think is really interesting about the standard is its iterative nature, and the idea that you put the system in place, but then you continually revisit it and you continually come back to it. Can you speak a little bit about that process of? I think it's designed to innovate innovate the innovation, I suppose. Yeah, maybe you can speak a bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you get your copy of the standard, there are actually sections that focus on monitoring and improving. And within the family of standards, there is an entire standard on measuring innovation, which I know has been tricky for everybody. It just is. So this gives some great guidance and some really tangible examples. But in essence, it's kind of that plan, do, check, act that we all know and love and really does work. So we plan to do something. We measured the results. Did we get it right? Did we not? If we got it right, are there any lessons we can take forward? If we didn't get it right, are there things we can learn and improve? Heck, even if we got it right, are there ways we can be faster, stronger, better, whatever it might be? And so what you really have to do to work with the standard is have that regular cadence of leadership review, regular cadence of measurement, all those things that go into how do we improve this over time. And going back to the beginning of our conversation, when you were asking about, do you think this is really becoming a discipline? I think that's a key part of the discipline is how do we improve the innovation program, progress, etc.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
And as we all know from our Six Sigma classes,
Yep.
you don't measure what you don't value, and you don't value what you don't measure.
Love that. Yep.
And you can't measure what you don't measure, you can't manage what you don't measure. So if somebody says our process is just cool, no, give me a number. And by the way, what does that number mean?
Yeah, it's also fascinating to me, having worked with organizations I would from the outside have considered to be very effective, innovative organizations, and how rarely they do the measurement piece well. It's kind of fascinating. So let's step over to the questions from the audience. So again, please feel free to put them in the chat if you have any questions. I'm going to pick up with the first one, which is, what experience do you have on avoiding overstructure innovation processes? In other words, what are the initiatives besides standardizing processes to strengthen creative thinking and foster an innovation culture in self-managing teams? Ooh, that's a good one. Who wants to kick off with that?
Doesn't matter to me. I'm happy to get the party
Great.
started, Willie, if that's
Go on
okay
then,
with you.
Sarah. Thanks.
All right. That's a big one. That's actually a really great question. And it comes into some of the planning, resourcing, that kind of thing. So when you're talking about creativity and techniques and that kind of thing, those are the tools. So I would think about that as how do we support our employees, suppliers, whoever we're innovating with the proper tools, techniques, etc. for the right purpose. It sounds like you're in the front end of innovation where all the fun stuff happens. Tons of great techniques. And with the standard, I just want to make it clear, you can still use all those great techniques that you want to use. Something else that is, definitely, I don't know if you've checked out Haier, H-A-I-E-R company. They're doing some really interesting restructuring with ecosystems and those kinds of things right now. And what they've really created are a series of, what do they call them? Micro enterprises within their company. Now, that's not easy to replicate and that kind of thing. That's going to take you some time. They really have a unique way to do that. But I think those are some of the things that you can really start to have those conversations around. And I think that really helps with just having the conversations. How are we structuring these things? How are we making sure people have access to creativity? How are, all those kinds of things. The standard helps the conversations happen, I think.
Interesting. Anything you want to add to that, Willie, before we move on to the next one? Okay, great. Well, another question from Frank. So I heard you touch upon the importance of and challenges related to continuous improvement. It seems to me that not least due to several changes in the external environment of many companies, including technological changes and changes in user needs, ongoing adaptation of the standards would be important. What specific methods to balance the need for standardization and continuous improvement? Oh, this is an interesting one. Yeah.
Well, the standard actually does not require specific processes. On a regular base, management system standard says something like the organization shall define their process for.
Right.
So how you do it, it's really up to you. So the standard only says you need to have a process for document control. Wonderful. You need to have a process for, I don't know, risk management, for internal audits. Wonderful. How you do that, that's really up to you. And that in itself then helps, obviously, to change those processes if and when you see the need for it. E.g., for example, if something didn't work out. And that really helps to be agile. And as a previous auditor for all kinds of management system standards, I can tell you, in the good old days when we still had these printed out documents, one trick was to just go through the documents like that with the thumb, looking at the revision date. And if documents were not updated in the last 2 or 3 years, I knew that they didn't improve.
Yeah.
So yes, I would expect that also the innovation processes are getting updated in due course and if and when necessary. Not necessarily daily, but also definitely not every 5 years. And the organization needs really to find what is the best cadence for their review and their updates. But yes, if something is wrong, then it needs to be updated.
Yeah. I think this is perhaps not quite related to the question, but it is an associated point, which is the good news is that when we have these different disciplines of, say, continuous improvement or quality and innovation, now we have a common structure that allows these management systems to actually interact, which in the past, innovation was always the difficult stepchild, right? Because it didn't fit with anything else, and every organization did it in a different way. And so I think this will help us for sure. Question more for you, Willie. I mean, when will the audit offerings starting to be available for organizations?
Oh, well, I wanted to say yesterday, but that was not, it would be not correct. I think we need to differentiate a couple of things here. We need to consider a couple of things. Yes, if there is an organization who wants to get audited and certified against the standard, I'm pretty sure we can do that within a couple of days, weeks. But, and this is the big but, at this moment in time, there is no accreditation of certification bodies. So there is not an official stamp, let's say from UCAS in the UK or from ANAB in the United States, that says, yes, you, SGS, are, an accredited certification body. But I can tell you from multiple previous experiences that we have introduced new products before the accreditation was possible. So namely 27701, that is the privacy management system, 42001, the AI management system. Those standards, when we introduced the assessments and the audits and the certifications, there was no accreditation possible. And we used that time between the publication of the standard and the accreditation as a learning curve kind of thing. And I'm a firm believer that making mistakes is part of the process of learning. And the more mistakes we do in that early phase, the better it is. But at the same time, that means, yes, the organization gets already certified by a reputable, recognized certification body. The only thing that is missing, well, the stamp from the accreditation body. In 42001, for example, the standard was published a year ago. And as of today, there is no accreditation body offering accreditation to the standard, which is okay, because the underlying 42006 is still not being published. And that is the standard that tells us as the CB what to do. In 56001, we are currently working on a new work product item, that's the official terminology, to create a document that tells us, the certification bodies, what we need to do to audit properly to 56001. Now, in the absence of this document, there is nothing that tells us from the external world what to do. That doesn't mean we cannot do it. I mean, an organization of 100,000 people and 7.5 billion Swiss francs revenue in the business of certification, I think we know a thing or two how to certify an organization. So to answer that question in a nutshell, hey, if you have interested organizations that are interested in getting certified to the standard, or if you are an organization that is interested in getting certified to the standard, please feel free to reach out. More than happy to discuss the details.
Pretty good. All right. So maybe last question before we end for today. From a change management perspective, any thoughts on how you can convince stakeholders to upgrade their existing systems and processes to 56001 or a certification level? I suspect the implied aspect underneath that is actually they probably feel they're pretty good at innovation already. And is there an extra benefit in going for certification? Maybe Sarah, you want to pick up that one?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. There are some great things out there. So like 9001, 14001, those have been studied by business, academics, all those good things. And what they actually have found is something around companies who actually do get certified don't have a decline in economics and sales and that kind of thing, where companies that don't get certified, once that starts to take off in their organization, they actually do see a decline. So I see it as a risk mitigation. If nothing else, it's a risk mitigation. There's a lot of good strategies there.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that's a really good observation. And perhaps people don't tend to think about that. We see, from the standard reports out there that the life cycle of organizations is declining, or it's very hard as we get to bigger and bigger organizations to be able to sustain ourselves. And I think that's a really good something that we can take away. The audit process means that it is robust, that we can can protect the future of an organization, perhaps. All right, with questions now flowing in, so I'm gonna pick up one more, and then we'll close out for the day. So again, question from Frank. He heard you mention plan, do, check, act cycle. What are the effective methods or ways of thinking that help avoid decisions being delayed or due to over planning? Oof, that's a tricky one for 2 minutes worth of remaining. You know what, Frank, I think we'll take that one offline and come back to you on that, because that's one's slightly tricky to detail in the time we have available. A couple of things from me. I wanted to thank firstly Sarah and Willie for joining us today and talking about this this new standard of 56001. It's a fascinating space, and I do think as an innovation management professional community, it's going to really help us to do the things that we've always wanted to do, but perhaps with a little bit more support and a bit more structure than we've had in the past. I think simply having that common language to be able to do things like open innovation a little bit easier than perhaps it would have been in the past, because we do have that common language between organizations. One other thing that might be of interest to you, if you are on the East Coast of the US, we have an event coming up for our clients and organizations that we're sort of friendly to, let's say, launching ISO from a hype perspective. I'm going to paste the link for that event into the chat. It is a free event. There's a few spaces available, so if you're interested in coming along, that'll be on the 9th of October in Manhattan. Please feel free to register. We'd love to see you there. So yes, a couple of questions we didn't get quite time to get to. We will come back to you in written form and share those back with everybody. And thank you for you, the audience, for joining. I hope you found it interesting. I certainly have. And until next time, thank you so much.